"Sir, please don't move." The voice was quiet, but it sliced through the low hum of conversation at the Harbor Glass restaurant with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Nolan Ashford, founder and CIO of the global hospitality empire, Ashford Meridian, froze. His hand, which had been gesturing toward a set of architectural plans, spread across the table, stopped midair. He was in the middle of outlining the final phase of a multi-million-dollar acquisition to Marcus Lee, his oldest friend and COO. The waitress had interrupted him. That alone was unusual. He turned his head slowly. "I'm sorry." She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with earnest brown eyes and dark, curly hair pulled back neatly from her face. Her uniform, a crisp white shirt under a dark blue apron, was immaculate. Her name tag read Sadie. She wasn't looking at him, however. Her gaze was locked on his left hand, which rested on the polished oak table. "My mother," Sadie said, her voice dropping to a near whisper laced with disbelief. "She has a ring exactly like that one." Her own hand, holding a heavy glass coffee pot, began to tremble. A tremor, then a violent shake. Dark steaming coffee sloshed over the spout, cascading onto the table. It splashed across Nolan's expensive suit and pooled over the pristine white renderings, the ink bleeding into ugly, brown blossoms. Marcus swore under his breath and grabbed a handful of napkins, but Nolan didn't move. He didn't even register the heat of the coffee soaking through his trousers. His entire world, an empire of five-star hotels and luxury resorts, had shrunk to the circumference of the silver band on his fourth finger. It was an old ring, its surface worn smooth by the passage of nearly 3 decades. But the engraving at its center remained sharp and clear. A stylized lighthouse, its single, powerful beam etched across the band. He hadn't taken it off a single day in 29 years. It was a private monument to a past he had never fully understood. A coincidence, Marcus murmured, dabbing at the ruined plans. This is a coastal town. Lighthouse imagery is everywhere. But Nolan knew it wasn't a coincidence. Not from the look in the young woman's eyes. It was a look of profound, earth-shaking recognition. "What is your mother's name?" Nolan asked. His voice sounded foreign to him, stripped of its usual authority, revealing a raw vulnerability he hadn't felt in years. Sadie finally lifted her gaze to his face. Her eyes were hazel, flecked with green. And in their depths, he saw a disorienting flicker of a memory, a ghost from a life he'd lived long ago. A life before the boardrooms and the stock market. A life filled with salt air and impossible promises. "Her name is Lorraine," she said, her voice regaining a fraction of its strength. Lorraine Monroe. The name struck Nolan with the force of a physical blow. Lorraine. The woman he had loved with the fierce, incautious passion of his youth. The woman who had vanished from his life without a word, leaving a void that no amount of success had ever managed to fill. He had come back to Bellwether Bay to oversee the renovation of the old Bellwether Grand Hotel. The very place where he had first met her. He'd told himself it was a strategic business move. He'd told Marcus it was about legacy. But he knew in the silent, honest chambers of his heart that he had come back searching for her. He rose slowly from his chair, his 6-foot frame feeling unsteady. The billion-dollar project, the meeting. Marcus, it all faded into an irrelevant hum. He was 58 years old, a titan of industry. But in that moment, he was 29 again, standing on the Bellwether Bay Pier, promising a brilliant, laughing young woman that he would be back. "Where is she?" He asked, the question torn from him. "Is she here? In this town?" Sadie took a half-step backward, her professional composure returning like a hastily donned suit of armor. She set the coffee pot down on a nearby tray with a sharp clatter. "I shouldn't have said anything. It was a mistake." "Please," Nolan said, the word tasting like rust in his mouth. He was a man who issued directives, who negotiated from a position of strength. He did not plead. But Sadie's expression hardened, her jaw set with a stubborn pride that was hauntingly familiar. "I don't know who you are, or why you have a ring like my mother's. But she's a private person. She's built a quiet, stable life for herself." She picked up the empty pot, her knuckles white around the handle. If you're just some ghost from her past looking to stir up old memories, I'm asking you to leave her in peace. Without waiting for a reply, she turned and disappeared through the swinging doors to the kitchen. Marcus let out a long, low whistle. Nolan. What in God's name was that all about? Nolan sank back into his chair, staring at the silver band on his finger. For 29 years, it had been an emblem of his greatest loss. Now suddenly, it was a compass. A compass pointing not just to a woman he had lost, but to a life he never knew existed. He had to find her. He had to know the truth. But the fierce, protective fire in Sadie's eyes was a clear and potent warning. This was a history he could not command, a past he had no right to claim. Cancel the rest of the afternoon, Nolan said, his voice clipped and decisive. He was already on his feet, shoving his phone into his pocket and leaving the coffee-stained documents to their fate. Marcus stood, watching him with a concerned frown. Nolan, hold on. You can't just bolt out of a meeting about a $250 million project. What's going on? Find her, Marcus, Nolan said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Find Lorraine Monroe. I need to know if she still lives in Bellwether Bay. I can do that, Marcus replied, his expression shifting from business partner to worried friend. But I'm doing it by the book. Public records only. No private investigators. No using company resources to run background checks. If she's here, she has a right to her privacy. We can't go at this like a hostile takeover. Nolan's first instinct was to override him, to use every tool at his disposal. But he saw the unyielding principle in his friend's eyes, a quiet decency that had often served as his own moral compass. He gave a curt, reluctant nod. Fine, public records only. Just find out what you can. Where she works, maybe. And Marcus, be discreet. I'm always discreet, Marcus said, already tapping on his phone. Back in the sterile luxury of his suite, at the only 5-star hotel in town, a bitter irony. Since it wasn't one of his, Nolan paced like a caged animal. The panoramic view of the Oregon coast, which had seemed so majestic an hour ago, now felt like a taunt. He tore at the knot of his silk tie, unbuttoned his collar. But the suffocating tightness in his chest remained. He went to his briefcase, bypassed the stacks of financial reports, and pulled out a small, worn leather box he rarely traveled with. This trip, however, had felt different, weighted with the gravity of the past. He opened the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded black velvet, was a creased photograph of a young woman with windswept brown hair and a smile that could eclipse the sun. Lorraine, she was laughing, her head tilted back. The Bellwether Bay lighthouse, a hazy sentinel in the background. Beneath the photo lay a folded piece of paper, thin and brittle with age. He unfolded it with delicate care. It was the original receipt from a small, long-closed jewelry shop owned by a craftsman named Harold Pike. The purchase was detailed in elegant, looping cursive. 2 custom silver bands, lighthouse engraving, find your way home inscription. The date was from 29 years ago, a lifetime ago. He remembered that day as if it were yesterday. He and Lorraine, sketching the design on a napkin at a seaside cafe. The lighthouse was their spot, the place they had met during a summer storm. The inscription had been his idea, a solemn promise whispered on the pier the day he'd left to save his father's failing business, a promise he had fully intended to keep. He'd returned just 2 months later, his family's company stabilized, only to find her apartment empty, her number disconnected. The landlord said she'd moved away, leaving no forwarding address. It was as if she had been erased. His phone buzzed, startling him. It was a text from Marcus. Lorraine Monroe, Thimpy Sufty, unmarried. She appears to work in the archives department at the Bellwether Bay Community Library. I did not look for her home address. Unmarried. The word hung in the air, electric and momentous. For decades, he had tortured himself with images of her happy married, with a family, a life that had moved on so completely it had no room for even a memory of him. But she was here, and she had a daughter named Sadie, who was 28 years old. Nolan's mind, accustomed to complex calculations, did the simple arithmetic. He had left town 29 years ago. Lorraine was 27 then. If Sadie was 28, it meant Lorraine must have found out she was pregnant in the weeks immediately following his departure. He stared at the joyful, unsuspecting face in the photograph. Had she tried to tell him? Had she gone through it all alone? The thought was a shard of ice lodging itself deep in his gut. He had built an empire on control, on leaving nothing to chance. Yet the single most significant event of his life had unfolded just a few hundred miles away, entirely without his knowledge. He grabbed his suit jacket from the back of a chair. He wasn't going to wait another minute. He wouldn't send a lawyer or an assistant. He wouldn't make a polite, carefully worded phone call. For the first time in 30 years, he was going to walk into the most important negotiation of his life, without a strategy, without leverage, and without a clue what to say. He was going to the library. The Bellwether Bay Community Library was a peaceful sanctuary of brick and glass, its air filled with the comforting scent of old paper, binding glue, and lemon-scented floor polish. Nolan's expensive shoes, which usually announced his arrival with a confident click on marble floors, were unnervingly silent on the worn linoleum. He bypassed the main circulation desk, his eyes scanning the signs that hung from the ceiling. A simple arrow pointed him toward the archives, tucked away in the quietest corner of the building. He found her in a narrow aisle, under a sign that read local history, the genealogy. She was standing on a small, wheeled stepladder, her back to him, carefully placing a heavy, cloth-bound volume onto a high shelf. Her hair, once a uniform cascade of brown, was now beautifully streaked with silver and tied back in a simple, elegant knot at the nape of her neck. She wore a soft gray cardigan, practical slacks, and sensible flat shoes. She was no longer the free-spirited girl in the photograph, but the quiet, deliberate grace in her movements was so profoundly, unmistakably Lorraine that it made his breath catch in his throat. He stood at the end of the aisle, a chasm of 29 years separating them. What does a man say? How do you begin to bridge a gap that wide? Hello seemed absurdly inadequate. I'm sorry felt like a drop of rain in a barren desert. He must have made a sound, a shifting of weight, an intake of breath, because she stilled. Her hands, which had been adjusting the book, rested on its spine. She didn't turn around immediately. It was as if she was gathering herself, preparing for an impact she had long sensed was coming. Then, slowly, she pivoted on the ladder and looked down at him. Her face was calmer than he had imagined, etched with fine lines of a life lived. But her eyes, those same intelligent hazel eyes, widened almost imperceptibly. There was no confusion, no moment of trying to place him. She recognized him instantly. Nolan, she said. It wasn't a question or a greeting. It was a statement of fact, spoken with a quiet finality, as if she were identifying a long-lost historical artifact that had finally been returned to the archives. She descended the ladder with measured care, placing each foot firmly on the rungs, as if to ground herself in the present moment. When her feet touched the floor, she stood before him, the tall, dusty bookshelf serving as a barricade between them. After all this time, she said, her voice a low, even murmur that betrayed nothing of what she might be feeling. Why now? I never stopped looking, he said, the words feeling thin and hollow even to his own ears. I came back for you, Lorraine. 2 months after I left, you were gone. A small, sad smile touched her lips, a fleeting expression of disbelief. You came back. When I never heard from you, I wrote, he insisted, taking a step closer. I called your old number until it was disconnected. It was like you had vanished. I wrote to you too, she countered, a hard edge creeping into her voice. I sent letter after letter to your office in Portland. The official address from your business card. I never received a single reply. They stared at each other across the aisle. Two people holding fractured halves of the same story, each believing they were the one who had been abandoned. The silence between them was thick with unspoken accusations and years of accumulated pain. I never got any letters, he said, the certainty in his voice absolute. Lorraine, I swear to you, I would have moved heaven and earth if I had. She searched his face, perhaps looking for the lie, but her expression remained guarded. It doesn't matter anymore. That part of our lives is over. It does matter, he insisted, his voice growing urgent. He had to ask the question that had been burning a hole in his soul since he'd left the restaurant. Today at the Harbor Glass, I met your daughter, Sadie. At the mention of her daughter's name, a flicker of emotion finally broke through her placid exterior. It was fierce, protective, like a lioness shielding her cub. You are not to bother her, Nolan. She recognized my ring, he said, holding up his left hand, the silver band catching the fluorescent light. Lorraine's gaze dropped to the ring, then to the identical one on her own hand, which she instinctively shielded with her other. It was a long time ago. She's 28, Nolan said, forcing the words out, each one a universe of consequence. I'm 58. You were 27 when I left. Tell me the truth. Is she my daughter? Lorraine held his gaze, her eyes a deep well of untold stories and ancient hurts. She didn't deny it, but she didn't confirm it either. That answer, she said softly, her voice resonating with a wisdom born of solitary strength, doesn't belong to just you and me anymore. It belongs to her too. She took hold of a cart laden with books, and began pushing it down the aisle, away from him. The squeak of the wheels was the only sound in the cavernous silence. She was leaving him again, not by disappearing from town, but by erecting a wall of principle he could not breach. He understood then that this wasn't a problem he could solve with logic or money. This was a family he had to earn the right to know. And the gatekeeper was a proud young woman who already had every reason in the world to despise him. Sadie found Nolan waiting for her in the service alley behind the restaurant as she was leaving for the night. The last rays of the setting sun cast long, distorted shadows against the graffiti-tagged brick walls, and the air was thick with the competing smells of the salty ocean and the greasy exhaust from the kitchen vents. Her shoulders, already aching from a long shift, tensed with a fresh wave of irritation. I asked you to leave her alone, Sadie said, her voice sharp and accusatory. She clutched the strap of her tote bag, its weight a familiar comfort, filled with her textbooks for her evening class in hotel management. I had to see her, Nolan replied. He looked utterly out of place in his impeccably tailored suit. A figure of corporate power dropped into the gritty backstage of her life. And now I need to talk to you. We have nothing to talk about, she retorted, trying to sidestep him. You saw her, she's fine. Now you can get back on your private jet and fly back to whatever life you came from. He moved, blocking her path. That's not the only answer I need, he said, his tone infuriatingly calm and measured, as if he were chairing a board meeting, not standing in a grimy alley. Sadie, I need to know for certain. I am proposing we conduct a private paternity test. It will be handled with the utmost discretion by a neutral, third-party lab. We can have the results in a matter of days. His words, intended to be practical and efficient, landed like a flurry of small, sharp stones. He wasn't talking about family or connection. He was talking about verification, about managing a potential complication. In his world, she wasn't a daughter. She was an unconfirmed liability. A complication you need to manage, she said, her voice dripping with a scorn she didn't bother to hide. Is that what I am to you? A loose end from 29 years ago that needs to be tied up. Nolan seemed genuinely taken aback by her interpretation. Of course not. It's simply a matter of establishing the facts before we can determine the appropriate way to move forward. The facts are that my mother raised me by herself. She shot back, the hurt she'd suppressed all day finally boiling over. She worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood, so I could have everything I needed. The facts are that for 28 years you were a ghost. You weren't here. The raw pain in her voice seemed to penetrate his corporate armor. His approach softened, but his methods, ingrained over decades of problem-solving, remained the same. I understand you're angry, he said, his voice lowering, and I want to help. I know you're taking classes at the community college. Hotel management, correct. Let me pay your tuition, all of it. Consider it a gesture of goodwill, regardless of the outcome of the test. That was the final, unforgivable straw. It was one thing to be treated like a problem, another entirely to be treated like a project for his philanthropy. All her life, she had prided herself on her work ethic, on her independence. It was the one thing that was entirely hers, earned through long hours and sacrifice. And he was trying to buy it from her in less than 5 minutes. You think you can just show up, write a check, and make everything okay? She snapped, her voice rising in disbelief. You think my life has a price tag? You have no idea who I am. I don't want your money. I don't want your goodwill. Her voice trembled with a rage that was mingled with a deep, unexpected pain. I want you to stay away from my mother, and I want you to stay away from me. She shoved past him, her shoulder bumping his hard. She didn't look back, hurrying down the alley toward the street, her heart pounding a furious rhythm against her ribs. Nolan stood alone as the twilight deepened, the alley lights flickering on. He had navigated hostile takeovers, faced down ruthless competitors, and weathered global market crashes. He knew how to leverage, how to negotiate, how to win. But in that moment, he was utterly defeated. He realized with a sickening clarity that he had no idea how to talk to his own daughter. Every tool that had built his empire money power, decisive action was not just useless here. It was toxic. He was trying to build a bridge, but every stone he laid was only making the chasm between them wider. Unseen, huddled in the deep shadows at the far end of the alley, a woman lowered her smartphone. Piper Cole, the ambitious host of the local news podcast, The Bellwether Beat, had been hoping to get a quote from a disgruntled kitchen worker about health code violations. Instead, she had captured something far more valuable. She hadn't heard every word, but the key phrases were crystal clear. The waitress's angry shout, the billionaire's name, and the furious, unmistakable mention of money. This was a story, a big one, and she was going to be the first to break it. The story broke the next morning, not as a formal news report, but as something far more insidious in the digital age. A 30-second, context-free audio clip posted to Piper Cole's podcast feed. The title was pure clickbait. Local waitress claims billionaire Ashford owes her more than a tip. The audio was grainy, distorted by the alley's acoustics, but Sadie's furious words were perfectly intelligible. You think you can just show up and write a check? I don't want your money. Piper's voiceover was slick, professional, and dripping with insinuation. That was the sound of a heated confrontation last night between a local waitress and hotel magnate Nolan Ashford in town to finalize his bellwether grand project. What could have the billionaire on the defensive? Sources say the young woman is claiming a family connection. Is she an opportunist looking for a payday? Or is there a secret hiding in plain sight in our quiet little town? By noon, the harbor glass was a circus. The usual lunchtime crowd of locals and tourists was swamped by a new kind of patron. Content creators, amateur journalists, and gawkers all holding up their phones, trying to get a selfie with the now infamous waitress in the background. A man with a vlogging camera followed her from a table, peppering her with questions about her claim as she tried to deliver a tray of clam chowder. The restaurant manager, Gary, a kind but overwhelmed man, pulled her into his small, cluttered office. Sadie, I'm so sorry, he said, gesturing helplessly toward the chaotic dining room. This is out of control. For everyone's safety. And for the restaurants, I have to take you off the floor for a few days. You can help with inventory in the stock room. A hot flush of shame and humiliation washed over Sadie. She was being hidden away in her own workplace, demoted from a valued employee to a problem that needed to be managed. Meanwhile, 20 floors above the town in Nolan's hotel suite, the situation was spiraling. His corporate communications team in Portland, operating on crisis management protocol, had issued a boilerplate statement without consulting him. It was designed to shut down a rumor before it could grow. Mr. Ashford has no comment on these baseless and opportunistic rumors. He has no personal connection to the individual in question. Marcus read the statement aloud from his tablet, His face grim. They were trying to protect you. They didn't know the truth you. Protect me. Nolan's voice was dangerously low, a quiet rumble of fury. They just stood on a global platform and called her a liar. As if on cue, his phone rang. It was Sadie. Her voice was shaking, not with sadness, but with pure, unadulterated rage. Did you see it? Did you see what your company said about me? Baseless and opportunistic. The whole town, the whole internet, thinks I'm some grifter trying to shake you down for money. Sadie, I did not authorize that statement, Nolan said quickly. Desperately, I'm going to fix this. I swear. How she cried, her voice cracking. By issuing another cold, corporate press release full of legal jargon. It's too late. The damage is done. You and your money and your perfect, polished reputation, you just bulldoze through people's lives and don't even look back at the wreckage. She hung up before he could respond. Nolan stood for a long, silent moment, the dead phone in his hand. He looked at Marcus. The guarded, controlled CIO was gone. In his place was a man watching his last, fragile chance at a family disintegrate before his eyes. He had tried to handle this with quiet discretion. It had failed. He had tried to handle it with money. It had backfired spectacularly. Now the media storm he had spent his entire career avoiding was raging, and its unwilling center was a young woman whose only crime was being his daughter. He had one move left. It was a high-stakes gamble that would obliterate any remaining hope of keeping this private. But she was right. The damage was done. His only choice now was who would control the narrative. He picked up his phone and dialed his head of communications in Portland. Get a new statement ready, he commanded, his voice ringing with an authority he hadn't felt all day. And you're not releasing this one. I am. An hour later, a new press release, personally signed by Nolan Ashford, hit the wire services. It was accompanied by a recent, serious-looking photo of him. The statement was short, direct, and unambiguous. The previous statement issued by Ashford Meridian was incorrect and released without my knowledge or approval. I have recently reconnected with Ms. Sadie Monroe and her mother, Lorraine Monroe, regarding a deeply personal family matter that dates back nearly 30 years. Miss Monroe is a young woman of unimpeachable integrity and is not seeking, nor has she ever sought any financial gain. I ask that the media and the public afford her the privacy and respect she deserves as we navigate this situation. Any further intrusion into her life will be met with a swift and decisive response from my legal team. He had just thrown a gallon of gasoline on the fire. He had publicly confirmed the rumor, officially linking his name to hers and painting an even bigger target on her back for every tabloid in the country. He had defended her honor, but in doing so, he had trapped her in the blinding glare of the spotlight with him. The secret was well and truly out, and he knew, with a sinking feeling of inevitability, that the one person who prized control and corporate stability even more than he did was about to descend on Bellwether Bay. His sister, Celeste. Celeste Ashford arrived in Bellwether Bay not like a concerned family member, but like a five-star general arriving to take command of a battle that was being badly lost. Her sleek black sedan, looking alien against the town's rustic charm, purred to a stop in front of the hotel just after sunrise. At 63, Celeste was the formidable chairman of the board of Ashford Meridian, a position she wielded with the precision of a master chess player. Dressed in a sharp, slate-gray pantsuit, her silver hair cut in a severe, elegant bob, she swept into Nolan's suite without so much as a knock. A deeply personal family matter, she said, her voice dripping with icy disapproval as she quoted his press release. Have you completely lost your mind? We are 2 weeks away from finalizing the Bellwether Grand Revitalization deal. The City Council needs to see impeccable stability, not a tawdry public scandal. This isn't a scandal, Celeste. It's my daughter, Nolan retorted, standing his ground. The words still felt foreign on his tongue, but he said it with conviction. She is an allegation until proven otherwise, Celeste countered, her eyes like chips of granite. And she stopped being just your daughter and started being a corporate liability the moment You attached her name to ours. Everything you do reflects on this company, on the legacy our father and grandfather built. You will not confirm anything else until we have irrefutable proof. A DNA test, and a legally binding non-disclosure agreement for this woman and her mother. Their names are Lorraine and Sadie, Nolan said through gritted teeth. And there will be no andes. They aren't corporate assets to be managed. Celeste let out a long, weary sigh, a sound of profound disappointment in her younger brother's romantic foolishness. You always led with your heart, Nolan. It was a weakness when you were 29, and it's a catastrophic liability now. If you won't handle this with the necessary pragmatism, then I will. Before Nolan could argue, she turned on her heel and was gone. He didn't need a map to know her destination. A cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He grabbed his keys and raced after her. He found them at the library near the main entrance. The scene was perfectly staged. Celeste was extending a manicured hand toward Lorraine, her expression a masterclass in polite, professional sympathy. Miss Monroe, she was saying, her voice smooth as silk. I'm Celeste Ashford, Nolan's sister. I am so deeply sorry for this dreadful media intrusion. I'm here to ensure we can resolve this delicate matter with the utmost discretion and, of course, generosity. Lorraine looked at Celeste's outstretched hand, as if it were a venomous snake, making no move to take it. Her face was pale, but her eyes, fixed on Celeste, were sharp and clear. We've met before, Lorraine said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through Celeste's performance like a razor. Celeste's practiced smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She tilted her head, a gesture of feigned confusion she had perfected in countless boardrooms. I'm so sorry, I meet with hundreds of people a year. I'm afraid I don't recall. Oh, I think you do, Lorraine insisted, her voice gaining a quiet, unshakable strength. It was 29 years ago, at the old Ashford Corporation office in Portland. You offered me a check for $10,000 and a piece of paper to sign. Nolan, who had just entered the library, stopped dead in his tracks. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He looked from Lorraine's resolute, accusing face to his sister's suddenly guarded expression. Celeste slowly retracted her hand, her mask of polite concern dissolving. You must be mistaken, she said, her voice now hard and clipped. I am not mistaken, Lorraine said, taking a small step forward, claiming the space between them. You told me your brother was in Europe and didn't want to be contacted. You told me I was a distraction he couldn't afford. She held Celeste's gaze. I didn't take your money then, Ms. Ashford. And I have no intention of signing any of your papers now. Nolan felt the floor drop out from under him. For 3 decades, he had lived with a story of abandonment, a narrative of loss that had shaped the man he became. His sister, Celeste, had been his partner through it all, his most trusted confidante, the co-architect of their shared empire. Now these two separate worlds, his past and his present, were colliding in the quiet, sunlit lobby of a small-town library, and the entire foundation of his life was beginning to crumble. He stepped forward, his presence shattering the standoff. Celeste, he said, his voice a raw, incredulous whisper. What is she talking about? Celeste turned to him, her composure finally cracking. For the first time in his life, Nolan saw not the unshakable chairman of the board, but his older sister, trapped in the glare of a lie that had stood for nearly 30 years. The air in the library's small, stuffy meeting room was thick with the weight of unspoken history. Nolan had insisted they go somewhere private, away from the prying eyes of the front desk librarian. He stood by the window, his back to the two women, staring out at a brick wall, unable to look at either of them. The betrayal was too fresh, too raw. Tell me, he commanded, his voice tight. The command was for Celeste, but his attention was fixed on Lorraine's faint reflection in the glass. Tell me exactly what happened. It was Lorraine who broke the silence. Her voice was steady, recounting the memory with the unnerving clarity of an event that has been replayed in the mind 1,000 times, each detail polished smooth by the friction of memory. I found out I was pregnant about a month after you left, she began, her gaze fixed on the back of Nolan's head. At first, I was ecstatic. I knew how much pressure you were under with your father's company. But I never doubted for a second that you would want to know. I wrote letters, simple, hopeful letters. They all came back, stamped return to sender. She took a shaky breath. I called the office, the number on your business card. A secretary always answered. She was always very polite, and she always said you were unavailable. After a few weeks of that, I knew something was wrong. So I took a bus to Portland. I found the building, this big, intimidating tower of glass and steel. She paused, and Nolan could hear the echo of that long ago fear in her voice. You weren't there. But she was. Lorraine nodded toward Celeste, who sat ramrod straight in her chair. Her face a stony mask. She took me into a conference room, Lorraine continued. I remember the smell of leather and wood polish. She was very calm, very professional. She told me you were in Europe for an extended business trip and had left strict instructions not to be disturbed. She said you were on the verge of a major breakthrough, the deal that would save your family's company, and that you couldn't afford any distractions. The word distractions hung in the stale air, cold and clinical. She said that you felt it was for the best if you both made a clean break, Lorraine said, her voice wavering for the first time as the old wound reopened. She said you were moving on to a different kind of life. Then she pushed a check across the table. $10,000. She said it was to help me get back on my feet. And a document, a legal document. She said it was just a standard release to formalize our amicable separation. Nolan finally turned from the window, his face a mask of cold fury and disbelief. He looked at his sister. You offered her hush money. You tried to pay her to disappear. Celeste met his gaze without flinching, her expression defiant. I was protecting you. I was protecting this family. Father was dead set against your relationship with her. He called her a small-town distraction. He was convinced she was a gold digger who would derail your future. Father Nolan's voice was hollow. The betrayal was compounding, spreading through his family tree like a sickness. This was his idea. He told me to handle it. Celeste admitted, lifting her chin. He said you were being a fool, throwing away your entire future for a summer romance. The company was on the verge of bankruptcy, Nolan. We needed you 100% focused. I did what I thought was best, for you, for all of us. You thought it was best to lie to me. Nolan's voice rose, cracking with a pain that was 30 years old, to lie to her. You stood by and watched me grieve. You let me believe she had abandoned me. You let her believe I had abandoned her. I was following Father's wishes, Celeste repeated, the phrase her unshakable shield. It was his decision. Lorraine, who had been watching this bitter exchange, spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. I didn't take the money, she said, looking at Nolan. I tore up the check right in front of her. I told her I didn't believe a word she said, that the Nolan I knew would never do that. She sighed, a sound heavy with years of resignation. But when I came home and the silence continued, when weeks turned into months and I never heard from you, I started to believe her. Your silence made her lies seem true. Nolan felt a profound, nauseating sense of dislocation. His entire adult life, the narrative of his great loss, had been a lie, a carefully constructed deception, engineered by his own father and executed by his sister. His father, a man he had revered, had been the architect of his heartbreak. And Celeste, his partner, his closest ally, she had been the gatekeeper, silently curating his reality with one devastating, life-altering lie. But a piece of the puzzle was still missing. Celeste's story explained the silence, the returned letters, but something more had to have happened, something final. He looked at Lorraine, whose face was a study in exhausted sorrow. But you didn't give up then? You said you didn't believe her. What changed? What finally convinced you that I knew? That I didn't want you? Lorraine's gaze dropped from Nolan's face to the worn, industrial carpet of the library meeting room. The protective anger that had carried her through the initial confrontation seemed to evaporate, leaving behind a deep, familiar sorrow that had been her companion for decades. A few months after I went to your office, she said, her voice so soft that Nolan had to lean forward to hear her. I received a letter. Nolan held his breath. Celeste, who had been a statue of defiant justification, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. It arrived in a very official-looking envelope. Lorraine continued, her eyes distant, lost in the memory. It was on your company's letterhead. Heavy, expensive paper. It wasn't handwritten. It was typed like a business letter. It was very formal, very cold. She looked up, and Nolan saw the raw, unhealed wound of that long-ago day. It said that my continued attempts to make contact were inappropriate and were interfering with your professional and personal obligations. It said that the time we had spent together was over, and it asked me, in no uncertain terms, to respect your decision to move on. The words were like a physical blow. Nolan felt the air leave his lungs. What else did it say? He asked, dreading the answer. It asked me not to do anything that might complicate your future. She whispered. The euphemism was so cruel, so precise, it could only mean one thing: complicate my future. Nolan repeated, though he knew the answer. I was 6 months pregnant by then, Lorraine said, a sad finality in her tone. It was a clear warning. Don't tell him about the baby. Don't ruin his life. Don't stand in the way of his ambition. And the signature, Nolan pressed, his mind racing, desperately searching for an explanation that wasn't the one forming in his head. What about the signature? It was your name, she said, her voice breaking on the final word. At the bottom of the page. In blue ink, it looked just like your signature, Nolan Ashford. I never wrote that letter, Nolan said, the denial tearing from his throat, fierce and absolute. Lorraine, I swear on my life, I would never ever have written that to you. His eyes shot to Celeste, a new, terrible suspicion taking root. Did you, he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Did you send that letter? Celeste shook her head, her face ashen. No, I swear, Nolan, I did what Father asked. I met with her, I offered her the money, but I never sent a letter. I wouldn't even know how to forge your signature like that. Lorraine let out a long, weary sigh, a sound of utter exhaustion. It doesn't matter now. Anyway, I don't have it anymore. For years, I kept it, tucked away in a box of things I couldn't bear to look at, but couldn't bring myself to throw away. It was a constant, painful reminder. She met Nolan's desperate gaze. About 10 years ago, my mother passed away, and I was cleaning out her attic. I found the box. I was finally in a good place. Sadie was a teenager. She was happy and thriving. I decided I didn't need that ghost in my life anymore. I took the letter out, tore it into 100 tiny pieces, and let them go in the wind off the pier. A dead end. The only piece of physical evidence was gone, scattered into the Pacific Ocean, a decade ago. Without the letter, it was his word against her vivid, painful memory. He could see the doubt still lingering in her eyes. How could he expect her to believe him? She had lived with that lie for so long it had become the cornerstone of her life story. To remove it would be to question everything. Celeste had lied. His father had orchestrated the separation. But the letter was the final killing blow. It was the calculated act of cruelty that had severed the last thread of hope. It was the reason Lorraine had raised their daughter utterly alone. He had to prove he didn't write it. But how? The ink was a memory. The paper was dust. Then, a detail from the past surfaced as clear and bright as the day it was forged. The rings, they hadn't just bought them from a store. They had designed them with an old-world craftsman, a jeweler who took immense pride in his unique, handcrafted work. Harold Pike, he was an old man now, retired for years, but Nolan remembered him as a meticulous, almost obsessive, record keeper. The rings had started this entire chain of events. Maybe the man who made them held the key to unraveling it. The lighthouse on the band was meant to guide him home. Perhaps its creator could help him find his way back to the truth. Harold Pike lived in a small, meticulously kept house on the quieter side of town, the kind with a perfectly manicured lawn and a workshop in the garage that was cleaner than most people's kitchens. At 74, he was a frail man with wisps of white hair and eyeglasses with lenses so thick they magnified his pale blue eyes. But his hands, though gnarled with arthritis, were as steady as a surgeon's. He peered at Nolan over the top of his spectacles as he led him into the workshop. The room smelled of metal polish, soldering flux, and oiled wood, a scent that instantly transported Nolan back in time. Nolan Ashford, Harold said, his voice a dry, reedy rasp. Well, I'll be. I haven't seen you since you were young and foolish enough to think a silver ring could solve all the world's problems. Nolan managed a tight, weary smile. It's good to see you, Harold. I'm hoping you can help me with a problem that ring created. He showed Harold the ring on his finger. The old jeweler took Nolan's hand in his own, holding it under a bright, articulated lamp. He adjusted a loop to his eye, leaning in close. A yes. I remember this one, Oregon silver, a good heavy gauge. A matched pair. He looked up from the ring to Nolan's face. The lighthouse and the inscription inside, find your way home. You and that lovely girl, Lorraine. You two were so happy. That's why I'm here, Nolan said, getting straight to the point. Harold, this is very important. Do you have any recollection of making any other rings like this? Another pair, or even a single one with this specific lighthouse design? Harold shook his head with definitive certainty, removing the loop from his eye. Absolutely not. This was a custom piece. Your design, your story, I made two, and only two, one for you. One for her. I never repeat a custom design. It's bad for business, and it's an insult to the memory. This was the first piece of hard, indisputable evidence. There were only two rings. It was not a coincidence. There's something else, Nolan said, choosing his next words with care. Lorraine tried to get in touch with me after I left Bellwether Bay. She told me letters she sent to my office were being returned. Do you remember her ever mentioning that to you? Harold took off his glasses and began to polish them with a soft, clean cloth, a gesture that gave him time to think. He was a man who preferred the quiet, predictable certainty of his craft to the messy, emotional complications of other people's lives. Things were difficult for her after you disappeared, he said hesitantly. This is a small town. People talk. It wasn't easy for a young, single woman. Did she ever ask you for help, Harold? Nolan pressed gently, sensing the old man's reluctance. The jeweler let out a long sigh, his shoulders slumping. He seemed to make a decision, a choice to step out of the quiet shadows of the past. She was a good kid, a strong one. But she was desperate. She came into my shop one day, close to tears. She told me the post office kept sending her mail back unopened. And the people at your company were giving her the runaround, wouldn't put her calls through. He shuffled over to a tall, dusty metal filing cabinet in the corner of the workshop. She had a sealed envelope, a thick one, addressed to you at your Portland office. She asked if there was anything I could do. My cousin Frank ran a small courier service back then, made deliveries to the big corporate offices in Portland every day. She begged me, Nolan, begged me to have him deliver it by hand, to make sure someone, at least, had to sign for it. Nolan's heart began to hammer against his ribs. And did you? Did you send it for her? I did, Harold said. He pulled open a drawer and retrieved a large, leather-bound ledger. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed and brittle. It was a logbook filled with dates, names, and descriptions written in a neat, spidery cursive. My wife always said I was a fanatic for records. Said I'd write down the time. I sneezed if I could find the right column for it. He flipped through the fragile pages, the dry paper whispering with each turn. He ran a gnarled finger down the columns, his lips moving silently as he read. Then he stopped, his finger resting on a single entry. Here it is, he said, turning the book around for Nolan to see. The entry was dated almost 29 years ago. It read one sealed envelope from L. Monroe to N. Ashford, delivered by Pike Courier Service to Ashford Corp. Main office. And there, next to it, in the received by column, was a signature. It was a quick, almost illegible scrawl, but the two initials were sharp and unmistakable. C.A. Celeste Ashford. Harold looked up at Nolan, his expression clouded with ancient worry. I never wanted to get involved. The Ashfords were a powerful family even back then. I just did what the girl asked and hoped for the best. You did the right thing, Harold, Nolan said, his voice tight with a cold, rising fury. He took a picture of the ledger page with his phone. This was it. The proof. Lorraine hadn't just sent letters to be lost in the mail. She had sent a package, hand-delivered, and his own sister had signed for it. Celeste hadn't just been following their father's orders to turn Lorraine away at the office. She had actively intercepted a private, hand-delivered communication. A communication that could only have contained one thing: the news that he was going to be a father. The meeting was held in a sterile, neutral space. The conference room of a small but respected law firm one town over from Bellwether Bay. Sadie had insisted on it. No Ashford Meridian boardrooms. No company lawyers breathing down their necks. Just the three of them, Nolan, Sadie, and Lorraine, and a calm, impartial observer named Naomi Price, a family mediator with a reputation for being sharp, fair, and unflappable. Sadie sat directly across the polished mahogany table from Nolan, her mother a quiet, supportive presence beside her. She had barely made eye contact with him since she entered the room. She had agreed to the DNA test on one non-negotiable condition: that Naomi would be the only one to receive the official results directly from the laboratory. It was her small way of reclaiming a sliver of control in a situation that had stolen all of it from her. Naomi slid a sealed 9 by 12 manila envelope into the center of the table. Its weight seemed to suck all the air out of the room. The results are here, she said, her voice even and professional. I have personally verified the chain of custody from the lab. Everything is in order. Are you all ready to proceed? Lorraine reached over and placed a reassuring hand on Sadie's arm. Sadie, her face pale, gave a small, jerky nod. Nolan, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, simply said yes. Naomi picked up a letter opener and slit the envelope with a crisp, clean motion. She unfolded the single sheet of paper inside and read it to herself, her expression giving nothing away. The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. Then she looked up, her gaze meeting Sadie's first, a small gesture of respect. The results from the accredited laboratory indicate a chin% probability that Nolan Ashford is your biological father, she stated, her voice clear and unambiguous. The clinical words fell into the silent room, each one landing with the weight of a stone. For Nolan, it was a moment of profound, earth-shattering validation. A tidal wave of emotion, grief for the lost years, relief at the confirmation, and a fierce, unfamiliar surge of paternal love crashed over him. It was true, it was real, she was his daughter. He had a daughter. He looked across the table at Sadie, his heart in his eyes. He saw the confirmation register on her face, not as joy, but as a kind of shock. He saw the slight tremor in her hands as she clasped them in her lap. She looked vulnerable, lost, and overwhelmed. In that moment, all he wanted in the world was to cross the room, wrap his arms around her, and tell her that it would be okay, that he was here now, that he would never leave again. He took a step forward, his hand outstretched. Sadie. She flinched. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but she recoiled, pulling back from his advance. It stopped him cold. This changes the facts, Sadie said, her voice strained but steady. But it doesn't change anything else. She looked at him, her eyes filled not with warmth or connection, but with a deep, guarded pain. A piece of paper doesn't make you a father. It just proves you weren't here for 28 years of my life. Her words were a necessary, brutal splash of cold water. In his single-minded quest for the truth, he had forgotten the much larger, more difficult reality. He was a stranger to her. A stranger who, however unintentionally, was responsible for a lifetime of absence and a week of public humiliation. As they filed out of the conference room, the new, unalterable reality of their relationship settling around them like a heavy cloak, Sadie's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen and froze, her face draining of all color. It was a news alert from Piper Cole's podcast website. The headline was stark and brutal. Billionaire Ashford confirmed as father of Bellwether Bay waitress, sources say. Sadie looked up, her eyes wide with shock and a fresh, devastating wave of betrayal. Her gaze darted from Naomi to Lorraine and finally landed on Nolan. How? She whispered, her voice trembling. How did they know? The only people in the world who knew were the people in this room and the lab. Nolan felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. The lab was reputable, bound by strict privacy laws. Naomi was the definition of professional integrity. That left his world, his company. Someone close to him, someone with access to his schedule, had leaked the information about the meeting, and a journalist had put two and two together. He had promised Sadie discretion. He had promised her privacy. And in the very first hour of being her confirmed father, he had failed. He was no longer just a man trying to understand his past. He was the source of the very threat from which he was supposed to be protecting her. This wasn't just about finding a lost family anymore. It was about defending them from the destructive power of the world he had created. The leak detonated a media firestorm. Nolan's hotel suite, once a quiet workspace, transformed into a crisis command center. Marcus, his face grim, was fielding calls from their public relations team, while Nolan paced the floor like a cornered lion. I'm putting out a full, detailed statement, Nolan announced, his voice sharp with fury. We'll lay out the entire timeline, the intercepted letters, Celeste's meeting with Lorraine, the forged signature. We're going on the offensive. Absolutely not, a calm, authoritative voice cut through his tirade. It was Naomi Price. At Sadie's request, she had agreed to stay on as an intermediary, and she was quickly proving her worth. You are not going to declare war on your sister, using Sadie's life as your ammunition. You have been making decisions about her for a week. Have you once stopped to ask her what she wants? Nolan stopped pacing as if he'd run into a wall. The question hung in the air, a stark indictment of his behavior. He looked over at Sadie, who was sitting stiffly on the edge of a plush sofa, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked small, exhausted, and on the verge of shattering. Sadie, he asked, his voice softening, all the fight draining out of him. What do you want? I want it to stop, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to be a headline. I don't want to be the billionaire's secret love child. I just want to go back to being Sadie Monroe, a waitress who is studying for her finals. She looked directly at him, her eyes pleading. If you have to say something, just make it clear that this is a private matter. And please make sure everyone knows I'm not asking you for a single dime. No inheritance, no job, no trust fund, nothing. I don't want anyone ever to think I'm doing this for money. Celeste, who had been listening from the doorway with a thunderous expression, saw her opening. She stepped into the room, a picture of cool-headed reason. That's a perfect solution, she said, her relief palpable. A simple, concise statement. It protects her privacy and simultaneously neutralizes the speculation about a financial motive. She paused, adding the crucial part. That will go a long way toward calming the city council's nerves about the Bellwether Grand project. The mention of the hotel deal was like striking a match in a gas-filled room. Sadie shot to her feet, her exhaustion replaced by a surge of righteous anger. Is that what this is all about? Protecting your business deal. Am I just a public relations problem you need to manage so you can get your permits to build a fancy new hotel? Of course not, dear, Celeste said, her tone patronizingly smooth. But one must be practical. The stability of the company and the thousands of jobs it provides is also at stake. I don't care about your company. Sadie shot back, her voice ringing with passion. I care about the fact that my mother can't go to the grocery store without being followed by someone with a camera phone. I care about the fact that I can't go to my job without being treated like some kind of pathetic Cinderella story. The battle lines were drawn. For Sadie, this was her life, her dignity, her identity. For Celeste, it was a variable in a complex business equation that needed to be solved as efficiently as possible. And Nolan was standing squarely in the middle. He saw the cold, ruthless logic in Celeste's position. He had lived his own life by that same logic for 30 years. But looking at Sadie's proud, wounded, defiant face, he knew that logic was no longer enough. It was a bankrupt currency in this new emotional economy. He turned to his sister, his decision made. The Bellwether Grand Project is not part of this conversation. This is about Sadie. We will do exactly what she has asked. He then turned back to Sadie, his expression serious. We will issue a statement that reflects your wishes. It will state unequivocally that this is a private matter and that you are seeking no financial connection to me or to Ashford Meridian. Is that acceptable to you? Sadie hesitated, searching his face for any sign of corporate maneuvering or hidden agendas. She saw none. She saw only a tired man trying clumsily and belatedly to do the right thing. She gave a small, hesitant nod. Later that day, the statement was released. It was brief, respectful, and focused entirely on Sadie's right to privacy. It was a move that frustrated the media, confused the stock market, and infuriated Celeste. But it was the first time Nolan had consciously and publicly put Sadie's needs before his own agenda. He knew it wasn't a victory. It was at best a temporary truce in a long war. He had proven for a fleeting moment that he could listen. But he had yet to prove he could be trusted. To do that, he would have to find a way to connect with her not as a CIO solving a crisis, but as a father trying to meet his daughter for the very first time. And that would require him to learn a new language, one that wasn't spoken in boardrooms or written on balance sheets. A few days later, after the media buzz had quieted to a low hum, Nolan sent Sadie a simple text message. It had taken him 20 minutes to compose. There's a place called the Salty Fork Diner on the Old Pier. They open at 7 p.m. I'll be there tomorrow if you'd like to join me for breakfast. No business talk, just breakfast. He had no idea if she would come. He arrived at Numjer Thinifun p.m., feeling a nervous energy he hadn't experienced since his first major business pitch. He came alone. No Marcus, no driver, no security detail. He wore a simple gray cashmere sweater and dark jeans, feeling strangely exposed without the familiar armor of a tailored suit. The Salty Fork was a perfect slice of small-town Americana. Cracked red vinyl booths, a long formica counter lined with chrome stools, and an atmosphere thick with the smell of frying bacon and strong, black coffee. He slid into a booth by the window and ordered a coffee. He watched the fishing boats head out into the misty dawn. Salzeun came and went, then Safifundet Safwan. Flee, just as a familiar disappointment was beginning to settle in. The bell above the door jingled and Sadie slid into the booth across from him. She wore a gray university hoodie, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked like she had just rolled out of bed, which she probably had. Okay, she said, avoiding his eyes as she grabbed a menu, its plastic cover sticky to the touch. You have my attention. What do you want? Pancakes, probably, Nolan said mildly, taking a sip of his coffee. I hear they're good here. Sadie looked up from her menu, surprised by his response. That's not what I meant. I know, he said, offering a small tentative smile. And the answer is, I don't want anything. I just wanted to sit down and talk with you, if you're willing. A waitress with a friendly face and a pencil tucked behind her ear came over. Morning, Sadie. The usual, she asked before turning to Nolan. The simple, familiar exchange seemed to lower the tension in the booth by a few degrees. They ordered, and the comfortable diner routine created a buffer of normalcy around them. So Nolan began, stirring a packet of sugar into his coffee, a nervous habit he thought he'd conquered decades ago. Tell me about your hotel management program. What's your favorite class? Sadie was wary, her answers clipped and cautious at first. She was expecting a trap, an angle, an inevitable offer to pull strings or pay for something. But he just listened. He asked follow-up questions. He seemed genuinely curious. Slowly, she began to open up, telling him about the challenges of balancing a full-time job with a full-course load. Before she knew it, she was talking passionately about her ideas for the hospitality industry. The biggest problem with the big hotel chains, she said, leaning forward, her earlier defensiveness forgotten, is that they treat their frontline staff, housekeepers, bellhops, servers, as replaceable. They have high turnover because there's no real path for advancement. No one invests in them. What would you do differently? Nolan asked, his gaze intent. I'd build a real internal career ladder, she said, her eyes lighting up with an excitement she usually reserved for her classroom presentations. A comprehensive cross-training program. Let a great server learn front desk operations on the hotel's dime. Let a talented, detail-oriented housekeeper train in event coordination. You invest in the people you already have, you build loyalty, and you end up with managers who actually understand every facet of the business because they've lived it. For the first time, Nolan saw the sharp, ambitious professional behind the waitress apron. He saw her intelligence, her empathy, her vision. He was deeply impressed. His every instinct screamed at him to say, "That's a brilliant idea. I'll fund it. We can launch a pilot program at Ashford Meridian." But he caught himself. That was the old Nolan, the CIO who solved every problem with a checkbook and a corporate directive. The new Nolan, the man trying to be a father, simply nodded, a look of genuine respect on his face. That sounds like a program a lot of people could benefit from, he said. You've really thought this through. They finished their breakfast in a surprisingly comfortable silence. As they stood to leave, Sadie paused by the door. Why this place? She asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. My father, Nolan said, a distant, complicated look in his eyes. Before the company got big, before everything became about everything else, he used to take me to a place just like this on Saturday mornings. It was the only time I ever really had him to myself. It was a small, unvarnished piece of his own history, one of the first he had ever offered her. Sadie just nodded, a thoughtful expression on her face. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say see you later. She just walked to her beat-up car and drove off toward her morning class. Nolan stood on the sidewalk, the salty morning air cool on his face, and watched her go. It was a small step, almost imperceptible. But it was a step in the right direction. He hadn't tried to fix her life or buy her affection. He had just listened. And for the first time, she had let him, with the immediate media crisis having subsided to a low, manageable hum. Nolan refocused his energy on the last great, unanswered question. The forged letter. He met with Naomi Price in her quiet, neutral office, laying out the story Harold Pike had told him and showing her the clear photograph of the jeweler's ledger. Celeste personally signed for the envelope Lorraine sent. Nolan said, the anger still fresh in his voice. She admitted it. But she continues to swear she didn't write the rejection letter and didn't know its contents. I need to know if it's possible she's telling the truth. Naomi studied the photo of the ledger, her expression thoughtful. This is compelling. It proves she received a package. It doesn't prove what was inside, or what she did with it after she signed for it. And it certainly doesn't prove she forged a letter using your signature. But the signature Lorraine remembers, Nolan pressed, leaning forward. She said it was a perfect match for my own. How could anyone have done that? Naomi tapped the end of her pen against a legal pad. Let's work through this logically, Nolan. 29 years ago, you weren't the public figure you are today, but you were still signing documents. How would someone in a corporate office get a perfect, replicable copy of your signature without your direct knowledge? Nolan's mind flashed back to the chaotic, desperate early days of the company. They were on the brink of collapse, constantly seeking investors, signing stacks of paperwork. My father, Nolan said slowly, a sickening realization dawning on him. He was the CIO. I was the COO. He had access to every document I ever signed. Contracts, letters. We even had a signature stamp for routine paperwork. A stamp. Naomi's eyebrows shot up. Are we talking about an autopen machine or a physical rubber stamp? A A rubber stamp, Nolan confirmed, the memory now crystal clear. A high-quality one. We used it for things like internal memos or bulk mailings to potential investors. We were trying to project an image of a larger, more established company. My father kept it locked in his desk drawer. Just then, Marcus Lee, who had been quietly digging through the company's digital archives, entered the room with a file. "I think I found something that might corroborate that," he said, handing the file to Naomi. "It's a scanned copy of an old investor prospectus from that exact year. Nolan's signature is on the first page, as was required." Naomi opened the file on her laptop and placed it next to her notes from her initial conversation with Lorraine. She had, with remarkable foresight, asked Lorraine to describe the signature on the letter from memory, its slant, the pressure of the ink, the way he formed the R in Ashford. Lorraine's memory was very specific, Naomi said, comparing the two. She said the signature looked too perfect. It was very neat, very official, not like the quick, personal signature you would have used in a letter to someone you loved. She pointed to the screen. And she's right, the signature on this prospectus, very likely made with that stamp, is a perfect match for her description. It's the formal, corporate version of your name. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. His father, determined to sever Nolan's connection to Lorraine, had instructed Celeste to intercept any communication. When Lorraine's hand-delivered letter arrived, the one Harold's cousin had couriered Celeste would have given it directly to him. Upon discovering Lorraine was pregnant, their father would have taken matters into his own hands. He had the official company letterhead, a typewriter, and a perfect, authorized replica of his son's signature. He could have created the cruel, dismissive forgery in minutes. So Celeste knew, Nolan said, the betrayal cutting deep all over again. She must have known Lorraine was pregnant. She gave the letter to father, and then she stood by and said nothing for 30 years. It's a strong theory, Naomi cautioned, bringing him back to the present. A very strong one. The comparison did not prove who created the letter, but it gave them a plausible explanation for how Nolan's signature could have appeared without his knowledge. Celeste can still claim she simply passed the letter on to her superior, your father, and never knew what happened after that. She's still lying, Marcus said, his voice a low growl. She knows more than she's letting on. Nolan looked at his friend, a man who had stood beside him for 40 years. We need more, Marcus. We need something that proves Celeste's silence wasn't just passive ignorance. We need to prove she knew and actively chose to hide it. Marcus shifted his weight, his expression suddenly troubled. He looked like a man about to confess a long-buried sin. "There might be something," he said, his voice low with regret. "Something I should have paid more attention to a long, long time ago." Nolan turned his full attention to his friend. "What are you talking about, Marcus? What did you ignore?" Marcus took a deep, fortifying breath, the confession clearly a heavy weight he had carried for years. "It was a long time ago, maybe 25 years ago, not long after we took the company public. Things were insane, just organized chaos. I was in the process of hiring a new executive assistant, and my old one, a woman named Eleanor Vance, was helping with the transition before she retired." He paused, gathering the threads of the memory. "We were going over office protocols, the flow of information, that sort of thing, and Eleanor made an off-the-cuff remark. She was a bit of a gossip, but a good person. She said something like, just so, Mr. Ashford's father and Ms. Ashford are very protective of his mail. Personal-looking letters sometimes get misplaced before they reach his desk. They like to screen things first." Nolan stared at him, a cold, creeping dread washing over him. "And you didn't think that was something you should mention to me?" "Honestly, no, not at the time," Marcus admitted, his voice full of a regret that was decades old. "I dismissed it. I thought she was a disgruntled employee gossiping about office politics. You were becoming a public figure. I assumed she was talking about unsolicited business pitches or mail from star-struck admirers. It never, for a single second, occurred to me that she was talking about something important. He looked Nolan in the eye, his own face etched with shame. I was buried, Nolan. We were trying to keep the company from going under during that first year, after the IPO. I made a judgment call. I decided it was office noise, and I forgot about it, until this moment. The confession hung in the air, a stark testament to the culture they had built. A culture where the business always came first. A culture that Nolan himself had championed. The fury that rose in Nolan was immediate and white-hot. This was his best friend, his right-hand man, the person he trusted more than anyone on Earth besides Celeste. And Marcus had heard a warning, a clear-as-day clue that could have unraveled this entire lie decades ago. And he had done nothing. You're telling me you had information that my own father and sister were screening my private mail. And you said nothing. Nolan's voice was dangerously quiet, each word a chip of ice. I didn't know, Marcus insisted, his own voice rising in defense. I heard a rumor, a piece of office gossip. Nolan, for God's sake, we were fighting to keep the lights on. We were on the verge of losing everything. I made a bad call in a high-pressure situation. You made the wrong one, Nolan snapped. He turned away, unable to look at his friend. The sense of betrayal was suffocating. First his father, the architect, then Celeste, the enforcer, and now Marcus, the silent bystander. The three pillars of his professional life had all, in their own way, conspired to keep the truth from him. He walked over to his makeshift desk in the hotel suite. You're off this, he said, his voice cold and clinical. I want you to hand over all your files on the Bellwether Grand Project and all internal communications related to this family matter. I'll handle it myself from now on. It was more than a reassignment, it was an excommunication. A punishment delivered with the swift, impersonal cruelty of a CIO. Just then, the door to the suite, which had been left ajar, opened. Sadie was standing there, holding a small cardboard box. She had texted earlier, saying she'd found some old photo albums of hers that Lorraine thought he might want to see. She stopped short, her eyes widening as she sensed the thick, hostile atmosphere in the room. Marcus looked from Nolan's rigid, unforgiving back to Sadie's uncertain face. He gave a single, weary nod, a look of profound hurt on his face, and walked out of the room without another word. Sadie watched him go, then turned her gaze to Nolan. What was that all about? It was a business matter, Nolan said dismissively, his tone sharp and final. Sadie's eyes narrowed. She took a step into the room, placing the box on a nearby table. It didn't look like business, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. It looked like you were firing your best friend. She looked at him, her perception unnervingly accurate. You do that, don't you? When you're hurt or angry, you use your power. You issue orders. You cut people out. It's easier for you than dealing with the actual, messy feelings. Her observation was so precise it felt like a physical slap. He had just done exactly what she accused him of. He had punished Marcus for a past mistake, instead of confronting his own overwhelming pain and sense of betrayal. He was acting just like his father, just like Celeste. He was using his power as a shield and a weapon. The daughter he barely knew could see him more clearly than he saw himself. And he didn't like the man she saw at all. The small cardboard box Sadie brought contained a lifetime. Nolan sat on the floor of the hotel suite, carefully turning the plastic-covered pages of old photo albums. He saw Sadie as a gap-toothed toddler, her face smeared with birthday cake. He saw her on her first day of school, dwarfed by an oversized backpack, her expression a mixture of terror and excitement. He saw her at her high school graduation, beaming with pride in her cap and gown. It was a silent, painful chronicle of the life he had missed, of the father he had never been. He and Sadie were sitting in a stilted, awkward silence when Lorraine arrived. She claimed she was just dropping off a book for Sadie, but Nolan knew she had come to check on her daughter, to offer her quiet, unwavering support. Seeing the photos spread across the coffee table, Lorraine's expression softened with a familiar, bittersweet H. She was such a happy kid, she said quietly, always so curious, always asking why. Nolan looked up from a photo of a 5-year-old Sadie gleefully pumping her legs on a swing set. I should have been there, he said, the words a raw confession. Yes, Lorraine agreed, her voice gentle but firm, free of accusation. You should have. She sat down, not next to him on the sofa, but in a separate armchair, creating a triangle of respectful distance between them. But Nolan, in the spirit of honesty, I need to admit something too. The letter wasn't the only reason I stopped trying to find you. Sadie and Nolan both looked at her, surprised. After I received it, Lorraine confessed, her gaze dropping to her hands, clasped in her lap. I was devastated, completely broken. But if I'm being completely honest with myself, a small part of me was also relieved. She looked up, her eyes full of a vulnerability Nolan had never seen before. I was terrified. I was 27, alone, and pregnant. The thought of getting into a fight with your powerful, disapproving family, of trying to force you into a life you might not have wanted it, was overwhelming. She took a breath, the confession clearly costing her. There was a friend, a mutual friend of ours from that summer, who was moving to Seattle. I had her new address. I could have tried to get a message to you through her. It would have been a long shot, but it was a possibility. But I didn't take it. Why not? Nolan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Because I was afraid of being rejected a second time, she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. The letter felt so cold, so final. I thought if I reached out again, and you confirmed it to my face or just ignored me again, that I wouldn't be able to bear it. So I made a choice. I told myself I would do it on my own. I would protect myself, and I would protect my baby by building a life where we didn't need you. Sadie stared at her mother, a look of profound, dawning sadness on her face. So you gave up on him? I gave up on the fight, honey, Lorraine corrected gently, her eyes full of love for her daughter. I was too tired and too scared to keep fighting. It was a decision I made out of fear, and in making it, I took the choice away from you too. That wasn't fair to you. You deserved the chance to know your father, and I let my fear get in the way of that. It was a stunning, courageous admission. For weeks, the narrative had been deceptively simple. Nolan and Lorraine were the helpless victims of his family's cruel interference. But the truth, as it so often is, was far more complex. Celeste and their father had built the wall between them, brick by mortared brick. But Lorraine, out of a deeply human mixture of fear and self-preservation, had chosen not to search for a gate. She was not just a victim, she was a participant in the long, deafening silence. As this new, more complicated truth settled over the room, Nolan's phone buzzed. It was a message from Harold Pike. Found something else while cleaning out the workshop. An old carbon copy receipt book from my cousin's courier service. Thought you might want to see it. An hour later, the elderly jeweler arrived at the hotel, holding a thin, flimsy piece of yellowed paper in a protective plastic sleeve. It was a delivery receipt, the carbon copy of the one given to the sender. It detailed the delivery of one envelope to the Ashford Corp. office, and at the bottom, in the space for the recipient's signature, was the same familiar, hasty scrawl from the ledger, CA. But this time there was something more. Next to the initials in the printed name box were 3 letters, hastily written but unmistakably clear, CEL. Celeste hadn't just scribbled her initials. In her haste, she had started to print her name. It was a tiny, overlooked detail, but it was everything. It proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that Celeste herself, not an assistant, not a mailroom clerk, had personally taken possession of the envelope Lorraine had so desperately sent. Her claim of not recalling the specific event was now impossible to maintain. Nolan finally had the proof he needed. Lorraine wasn't the only one who had made a choice that day. Celeste had made one too. Nolan didn't summon Celeste to a meeting. He simply went to her suite, let himself in with his master key, and laid the evidence out on her dining table like a prosecutor presenting his final argument. The photo of Harold's ledger, the flimsy carbon copy of the receipt with her partial printed name, and Naomi's analysis of the signature stamp. When Celeste walked in from her bedroom, she saw it all displayed under the lamplight. Her carefully constructed facade of control, maintained for 30 years, finally shattered. She sank into a chair, the long, exhausting fight draining out of her. "All right, Nolan," she said, her voice a weary sigh of surrender. "Ask your questions." "I only have one," he said, his voice hard and cold. "Tell me everything, the truth, all of it. No more lies." Celeste took a long, shaky breath, her gaze fixed on the damning receipt. "Lorraine is right. I remember the meeting perfectly, and I remember signing for that envelope." She looked at the receipt. I knew it was from her. I took it directly to Father's office. He was on a conference call with our lenders in Europe, trying to stop them from calling in our loans. I left it on the center of his desk so he wouldn't miss it. She paused, her gaze turning inward, traveling back across the decades to that fateful afternoon. He called me back into his office about an hour later. He was holding the letter. It was no longer in the envelope. He had opened it. Nolan leaned forward, his hands gripping the back of a chair. "What did it say, Celeste?" "It said she was pregnant," Celeste whispered, the words finally escaping after 30 years of confinement. "She wrote that she had tried to reach you in every other way, that she knew the timing was terrible with the company's troubles, but that you had a right to know you were going to be a father." The air was punched from Nolan's lungs. He felt lightheaded, dizzy with the force of the betrayal. Celeste had known. From the very beginning, she had known there was a child. Father was apoplectic, Celeste continued, her voice gaining a defensive, justifying edge. He started pacing, ranting that it was a trap, that she would use the child to ruin you, to get her hands on the family money, to take a piece of the company. He looked at me and said, "Nolan cannot be distracted by this right now. The fate of this entire company of hundreds of employees rests on him closing this European deal. I will handle this. I will make this go away. And you just let him." Nolan's voice was laced with disbelief. "You just stood there and let him make it go away." "I was only 34, Nolan," she pleaded, her voice rising. "I was terrified, and Father controlled every major decision in that company. We were days, not weeks, from total bankruptcy. He told me he would talk to you about it himself after the deal was closed, after everything was stable again. I chose to believe him. But he never did," Nolan stated, the words a flat, dead weight. "No," she admitted, her gaze falling. "A week later, he showed me a carbon copy of the letter he had typed and sent to her. The one with your stamped signature. He told me the problem is solved. It's for the best. He'll thank me one day. He told me to never speak of it again, and you believed it was for the best." Nolan pressed, his voice merciless. Celeste hesitated, and in that single, fatal hesitation, Nolan found the bitterest truth of all. "I had my doubts," she confessed, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I knew how much you cared for her. A part of me knew it was a monstrous thing to do. But Nolan, you have to understand the pressure we were under. I looked at the bigger picture. I chose the company. I chose to protect our family's legacy, the jobs of our employees. I chose to protect you. You didn't protect me," Nolan said, his voice finally breaking with the weight of 3 decades of a life built on a lie. "You made a choice for me. You and Father. You sat in that office, and you decided what my life was going to be. You decided I wasn't strong enough or smart enough to be a father and run a company at the same time." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the twinkling lights of the small town where his daughter had grown up without him. "A stranger. You didn't do it to save the company, Celeste," he said, his back to her. "You did it because you couldn't stand to lose control. You've never been able to." He saw it all with a terrible, devastating clarity. It had never been just about money or legacy. It was about his family's suffocating, arrogant belief that they knew best, that their control was a righteous form of protection. And in the name of that protection, they had stolen his chance to be a father, and stolen Sadie's chance to know hers. The cost of their control had been his life. The fallout from Celeste's full confession was swift and brutal. Armed with the undeniable truth, Nolan wasted no time. He called an emergency meeting of the Ashford Meridian Board of Directors. A grim assembly of faces on a video conference screen. Celeste Ashford was aware that Lorraine Monroe was pregnant with my child and actively concealed that information for 29 years, Nolan stated, his voice a low, emotionless monotone as he laid out the facts with chilling precision. This deception has caused irreparable personal harm and has now exposed this company to a significant and damaging public relations disaster. As CIO, I am recommending her immediate suspension as chairman of the board, pending a full internal investigation into her conduct. He expected a fight, arguments, a demand for more proof. But the stunned silence from the other board members was even more damning. It was Celeste herself who finally spoke, her voice strained but unbowed, broadcasting from her own hotel suite. This is a family matter, Nolan, not a corporate one. You are allowing your personal feelings to cloud your business judgment. To remove me from my position now, in the critical final stages of the Bellwether Grand negotiations, will signal deep instability to the City Council and our financial partners. It will jeopardize the entire project. A shrewd, influential board member named Elena Ramirez finally broke the silence. With all due respect, Nolan, Celeste has a point, she said, her tone cautious but firm. From an outside perspective, this looks like a family feud boiling over into the boardroom. Your judgment is also in question here. You have been the public face of this crisis from the beginning. She paused, letting her words sink in. Perhaps it would be for the best if both of you were to step back from an active leadership role, just for a short time. Let Marcus Lee take over as interim CIO to guide us through the Bellwether negotiations. It would show the City Council and our investors that the company is stable, that it is bigger than one family's personal drama. The suggestion was a stunning, blindsiding blow. Nolan had intended to seize control, to finally wield his power to right a 30-year-old wrong. Instead, he was being asked to relinquish that same power. The board saw him not as a wronged man seeking justice, but as a liability, just as compromised by the emotional fallout as Celeste. His every instinct, honed over a lifetime of corporate warfare, screamed at him to fight. He was Nolan Ashford. He didn't step back. He pushed forward. He could rally the shareholders who were loyal to him. He could turn this into a brutal power struggle. One he was confident he could ultimately win. But then he thought of Sadie. He heard her voice in his head, her sharp, accurate accusation. When you're hurt or angry, you use your power. If he fought this, he would be proving her right. The battle for control of Ashford Meridian would become the new, sensational headline. She and Lorraine would be dragged through the mud all over again, their deeply personal story reduced to mere cannon fodder for a corporate war. He looked at the small square on the screen showing Marcus, who sat stone-faced and silent. Marcus hadn't sought this. He was being offered the position because he was seen as the steady hand, the one person who could separate the business from the mess. And despite their recent, painful conflict, Nolan knew the board was right. Marcus was the best choice for the company at that moment. I agree, Nolan said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. The shock on the faces of the board members was palpable. I will take a voluntary leave of absence for 60 days. Marcus will assume my duties. The company needs to move forward without this distraction. His capitulation was met with a collective, audible sigh of relief. Celeste stared at her screen, utterly shocked. She had prepared for a war. She had never, in a million years, expected him to surrender. By willingly giving up his power, Nolan had done the one thing his sister never could. He had prioritized the well-being of others, Sadie, the company, its employees over his own ego, and his burning need for control. He ended the call and stood in the silent suite. He had lost his title, his power, his authority. For the first time in his adult life, he was not the CIO. He was just a man with a shattered relationship with his sister, a fractured friendship with his best friend, and a daughter he was only just beginning to know. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt like he might finally be on the right path. Stripped of his corporate duties and the relentless demands of his schedule, Nolan found his days, stretching before him, vast and unnervingly empty. There were no meetings to run, no calls to take, no multi-million-dollar deals to close. There was only time and silence. A few days into his forced leave, his phone rang. It was Sadie. Her voice was hesitant, uncertain. Hi. I'm going to my mom's old apartment building. She still has a few things in a storage locker in the basement. I thought, well, if you wanted to, you could come with me. It was the first invitation she had ever extended to him. It was a peace offering. I'll be there, he said immediately, his heart giving a hopeful leap. The apartment building was a modest, slightly run-down two-story structure above a laundromat on a noisy street. It was a universe away from the manicured estates and glass-walled penthouses Nolan inhabited. Sadie unlocked a padlock on a small, dusty storage locker in the building's damp basement. We lived here until I was 12, she said, her voice echoing slightly in the concrete space. She pulled out a cardboard box with photos, scrawled on the side in black marker. Mom worked at the diner during the day and did medical transcription at night. Right at our little kitchen table. I used to fall asleep to the sound of her typing. She opened the box and handed him a stack of worn photo albums. Nolan sat on an upturned plastic crate, the air cool and musty, and began to turn the pages. He saw Sadie losing her first tooth, a proud gap-toothed grin on her face. He saw her riding a pink bicycle with training wheels, her face a mask of fierce concentration. He saw her holding up a messy finger painting, a triumphant masterpiece of red and blue. In the background of many of the photos, he saw Lorraine, younger but with the same familiar lines of exhaustion and love around her eyes, looking at her daughter with a fierce, unwavering pride. Every picture was a testament to a life he had not been a part of, a universe of small, precious, ordinary moments that had unfolded entirely without him. The pain of it was a dull, constant ache in his chest. The old Nolan, the CIO, would have tried to fix it, to compensate for it. He would have offered to buy her a new house, to set up a trust fund, to retroactively pay for every scraped knee and school trip. But the Nolan sitting in that dusty basement, the man who was trying to be a father, just looked at the photos in silence. He didn't make grand offers or empty promises. Tell me about this one, he said, his voice a little rough, pointing to a photo of a teenage Sadie standing awkwardly in a slightly too big seafoam green dress. Sadie let out a small laugh. That was my junior prom. Mom sewed that dress herself from a pattern. She stayed up all night to finish the hemming. I felt like a princess, even though it was a little lopsided. He listened, completely rapt, for over an hour as she walked him through her childhood. He learned about her favorite third-grade teacher, Mrs. Gable. He learned about her first heartbreak, a boy named Kevin who moved away. He learned about her summer job scooping ice cream on the pier. He wasn't just learning facts about her life. He was seeing the world through her eyes, feeling the texture of the childhood she'd had, a childhood shaped by love and resilience, but also by his absence. When they were done, Sadie carefully closed the last album. I used to hate that we didn't have a lot of money. She confessed, her voice quiet. I was embarrassed by this apartment, by my second-hand clothes. But looking back at these, Mom made it a good life. We always had enough of what mattered. Nolan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. She did an incredible job, he said, looking at the strong, kind, intelligent woman his daughter had become. She gave you everything. As they packed the boxes back into the storage locker, Sadie paused. You know, she said, a note of surprise in her own voice. I think this is the first conversation we've had where you haven't offered to pay for something. Nolan met her gaze, his own eyes full of a sad understanding. I'm starting to realize, he said softly, that the things I missed can't be bought. She held his gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He was finally, slowly, painfully, starting to learn. He couldn't buy back the years. All he could do was show up for the days that were left and bear witness to the stories of the ones he had lost. One afternoon, an email landed in Sadie's inbox that made her heart simultaneously leap and plummet. It was an invitation to interview for a highly competitive management training program at a prestigious boutique hotel chain based in Seattle. It was the exact job she had been dreaming of, a real tangible stepping stone to the career she wanted to build for herself. She had applied for it months ago, long before Nolan Ashford had walked back into her life and turned it upside down. Her initial wave of excitement was quickly chased by a familiar, sickening anxiety. Had they Googled her? Did they see the news articles and connect her name to Nolan Ashford's? Was this a genuine opportunity based on her application, or was she now just a curiosity, the billionaire's long-lost daughter they wanted to meet? The thought that her own merit could be so easily overshadowed by his name and his money was mortifying. Her first impulse was to delete the email, to retreat back into the safety of her predictable life. Instead, she did something that surprised even herself. She picked up her phone and called Nolan. "I got an interview," she said, her voice a jumble of nerves and excitement. "For that management program in Seattle. It's a really big deal." "Sadie, that's wonderful news," Nolan said, and the genuine pride in his voice was unmistakable. "I'm not surprised at all. I'm worried," she confessed, the anxiety tumbling out of her. "I'm worried they only called me because of you. Because of all of this. Your last name is Monroe," he reminded her gently but firmly. "And you got that interview because you are a top student in your program, and you have years of practical, hands-on experience that the other candidates probably don't. You earned this, Sadie, on your own." This was the critical moment. The old Nolan would have seen an opportunity to help to control, to ensure her success. He would have said, "I know the CIO of that hotel chain. Let me put in a good word for you." But he didn't. Instead, he said, "Would you like to practice? We could do a mock interview. I've been on the other side of that table a few thousand times. I can tell you what they're looking for." And so they did. For the next few evenings, they met for coffee at a neutral cafe in town. Nolan grilled her with questions. He was tough, relentless, and incredibly insightful. He challenged her on her 5-year plan, on her leadership philosophy, and on her specific ideas for improving guest experience and employee retention. He didn't give her the answers, he pushed her to find her own, to sharpen her arguments, and to articulate the vision he had first heard about at the Salty Fork Diner. He treated her not as his fragile, long-lost daughter, but as a promising young professional he respected. The day of the interview, she drove the 3 hours to Seattle feeling more prepared and confident than she had ever felt in her life. She nailed the questions because they were the same ones Nolan had already forced her to answer. She spoke with passion and intelligence about her ideas for employee development programs, ideas she had refined under his critical, expert feedback. She left the interview on a high, feeling certain that she had been judged on her own merits, on the content of her character, and the quality of her ideas. That evening, as she drove back down the I-thumb toward Bellwether Bay, her phone rang. It was Nolan. "How did it go?" he asked, a hopeful tension in his voice. "It went really well," she said, a huge, genuine smile spreading across her face. "I think they liked me. They're calling me back for a final round." "I knew you would," he said, and she could hear the answering smile in his voice. For the first time, she hadn't just called him with a problem or an accusation. She was calling him to share good news, to share a victory. It was a small, simple moment, but it felt significant, like the first green shoot pushing its way up through frozen ground. The relationship between them was slowly, cautiously being built, not on a shared past or a biological link, but on a foundation of shared respect. One mock interview, one piece of good news at a time. A fragile, delicate trust was beginning to form, a trust that was about to be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. The news story dropped on a Thursday morning, a digital bombshell detonated by Piper Cole. The headline was a masterpiece of sensationalism and insinuation. I exhale you at IVI. Ashford Meridian prepped secret USH fund for billionaire's daughter. The article was accompanied by a scanned image of a leaked internal memo from the Ashford Meridian Legal Department. The document, dated the day after the DNA test results were confirmed, outlined a proposal to create a multi-million-dollar tax-advantaged discretionary fund for once Monroe. The language was cold and corporate, framing the fund as a strategic tool to mitigate potential future claims and ensure long-term discretion regarding the sensitive family matter. The implication was clear, immediate, and poisonous. Sadie Monroe was a liar and a hypocrite. Her public declarations of wanting no money were nothing but a performance. Behind the scenes, she had been negotiating a secret, multi-million-dollar payday in exchange for her silence. The public backlash was swift and vicious. The comments section of the article was a cesspool of vitriol, calling her a gold digger, a fraud, a master manipulator. Her phone exploded with notifications, a torrent of digital hate from strangers. When she went to work for her evening shift, the atmosphere was different. Her coworkers, who had been so supportive, now looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. The fragile sense of normalcy she had fought so hard to reclaim was shattered. She drove to Nolan's hotel after her shift, her hands shaking with rage. She stormed into his suite without knocking, finding him reading on the couch. "What is this?" she demanded, shoving her phone in his face, the damning article glowing on the screen. "A discretionary fund. A way to ensure my discretion. Is that what I am to you, Nolan? A potential claim to be mitigated." Nolan looked at the memo, and all the color drained from his face. "Sadie," he said, standing up quickly, "I can explain." "Can you?" She shot back, her voice thick with the sting of betrayal. "Answer me one question. Did you or did you not order your lawyers to draw up this proposal?" He couldn't lie to her, not now. "Yes," he admitted, his voice low and full of shame. "I did. It was right after the test results came in. My mind was still working in the old way. I was thinking like a CIO, not a father. I was thinking about securing your future, about protecting you, and yes, about protecting the company. It was a contingency plan you never bothered to mention to May." She cried, her voice cracking. "While I was out there, telling the entire world that all I wanted was my privacy, you were secretly meeting with your lawyers, arranging to buy my silence. You were still trying to control me, to manage me like a business problem that could be solved with enough money. It was never activated," he pleaded, his voice desperate. "It was just a proposal on paper. I realized almost immediately that it was the wrong approach, that it was an insult to you. I never told you about it because I was ashamed of it. I never wanted you to see it." But she had seen it, and the damage was done. The trust they had so carefully, so tentatively built over early morning breakfasts and late-night interview prep sessions was gone, incinerated by the cold, hard text of a single leaked document. All her worst fears about him, that he was calculating, that he was controlling, that he saw her as a liability, had just been confirmed in black and white. "I actually believed you were changing," she said, her voice dropping to a heartbroken whisper. "I actually started to trust you. How stupid of me. Sadie, please don't do this." "No," she said, taking a definitive step back, her protective shield slamming firmly back into place. Her eyes were hard, impenetrable. "You asked me to give you a chance, and this is how you used it. Stay away from me. Stay away from my mother. Don't call, don't text. I'm done." She turned and walked out, the click of the closing door echoing in the cavernous, silent suite. Nolan stood alone, utterly defeated. He had lost everything. His position as CIO, the trust of his best friend, and now the fragile, budding connection with his daughter. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the leak had been a deliberate act of sabotage, a poisoned arrow fired from inside his own company, and it had hit its mark perfectly. He had hit rock bottom, brought down not by a market crash or a hostile takeover, but by the lingering ghost of the man he used to be. Nolan sat in the silent suit for a long time, the echo of the closing door a deafening roar in his ears. Sadie's final words, "I'm done," replayed in his mind, a verdict and a sentence. The old Nolan, the corporate warrior, would have gone to war. He would have issued a scathing denial, claimed the memo was a fabrication, and launched an all-out legal assault on Piper Cole and her publication. That was the Ashford Meridian way. Deny, deflect, destroy. But that was the way that had led him to this exact moment of desolation. It was a bankrupt strategy. He picked up the phone and made a call, not to his lawyers, but to Naomi Price. "I need your help," he said, his voice heavy but resolved. "I'm going to tell the truth, all of it. No more hiding." That afternoon, through Naomi's office, to ensure its credibility, Nolan released a second, much longer statement. It was unlike any corporate communication Ashford Meridian had ever produced. It was not a press release, it was a confession. He confirmed the leaked memo was authentic. He admitted without reservation that he had ordered it prepared, and he explained, with painful honesty, why. "My initial reaction to learning I had a daughter was to resort to the tools I have used my entire life. Money and legal strategy," the statement read. "It was a mistake. It was an instinctive, but deeply flawed, attempt to control a situation that required trust, not contracts. I never discussed this proposal with my daughter, Sadie Monroe, nor did she have any knowledge of its existence. The fact that it was created without her consent is a profound failure of judgment, and it is a failing for which I take full and sole responsibility. It betrayed her trust, and I understand completely why she now feels unable to have any contact with me." He didn't blame Piper Cole for publishing the leak. He didn't blame the anonymous source. He owned the action itself. It was a stunning act of public self-incrimination, a complete surrender. In her small podcast studio, Piper Cole read the statement, and for the first time in her ambitious career, she felt a pang of journalistic guilt. She also felt a professional sting. Her first report, the one that broke the Deanne Ice story, had been based on a shaky foundation. She later admitted in a follow-up piece that it had relied on an unverified tip from someone who had merely seen Nolan and Sadie leaving the mediator's office. The source had guessed correctly, a lucky break that had launched the media storm. But they had never actually seen the results. It was sloppy, and she knew it. Nolan's raw, unconditional apology now made her question her source's motive for the memo leak. This wasn't just about exposing a secret. It felt personal, like an assassination. She started digging. Over the next several days, Piper reviewed metadata from the original email, compared internal company distribution lists she'd acquired from other sources, and spoke with multiple off-the-record employees at Ashford Meridian. The digital breadcrumbs eventually led her to a mid-level employee in the communications department, someone known throughout the company for their fierce, almost fanatical loyalty to Zelyth Ashford. Piper called the source directly. "The memo you sent me," she said, her voice cold. "Did Zelyth Ashford know you were leaking it?" There was a long, panicked silence on the other end of the line, fearing they were being set up to be the sole scapegoat. The employee finally cracked, offering a carefully worded, corporate non-denial. "Ms. Ashford is kept apprised of all communications strategies designed to protect the company's stability." It was all Piper needed. Zelyth knew. Perhaps she hadn't given the direct order, but she had been aware of the pressure campaign and had done nothing to stop it. She had allowed her loyal subordinate to fire a poisoned arrow at her own brother, knowing full well that Sadie would be the one to bear the worst of the wound. Zelyth's betrayal was not a single event buried 30 years in the past. It was an ongoing pattern of ruthless control. And this time she had used Sadie's life as the battlefield for her war with Nolan. Nolan walked into Zelyth's hotel suite without knocking. He placed a tablet on the polished table in front of her. On the screen was Piper Cole's updated article, a follow-up to the leak. The new headline read, "Source of Ashford memo leak traced to faction loyal to Chairman Zelyth Ashford." Zelyth read it, her face a mask of stone. This is circumstantial hearsay from a disgruntled employee. I will deny any involvement. Don't, Nolan said, his voice flat and devoid of its usual energy. Don't lie to me anymore. Celeste. I am so tired of the lies. He sank into the chair opposite her, the weight of the last few weeks pressing down on him. I know why you did it, or why you let it happen. You wanted the board to lose all faith in me. You wanted me out, permanently. I wanted to protect the company from your emotional recklessness, she retorted, her voice sharp. No, Nolan said, shaking his head slowly. This goes deeper than that, deeper than the company. He leaned forward, his eyes locking on hers. After Father died, you were the executor of his will. You went through all his papers, his files. Did you find anything? In his private safe deposit box, perhaps? Celeste's legendary composure finally fractured. A flicker of something guilt, fear. A long-buried secret crossed her face before she could suppress it. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, Nolan pressed, his voice relentless. He kept everything, old contracts, letters, documents. He would have kept a copy of the letter he sent to Lorraine. The forgery. Did you find it? Celeste? She was silent for a long time, the only sound in the opulent, sweet, the low hum of the air conditioning. Her silence was its own confession. Yes, she finally whispered. The admission was barely audible, a ghost of a word in the silent room. About 10 years ago, I was clearing out his safe deposit box at the bank. I found his entire file on her, the original letter she sent to the office, the carbon copy of the one he sent back. There was even a report from a private investigator he hired to track her after she moved to her aunt's house. Nolan felt the last vestiges of any familial affection he had for her turn to ash. You've known for 10 years, he asked, his voice a raw whisper of disbelief. You've known for a decade for an absolute certainty that Father faked that letter, that he lied to us both, and you still said nothing. The company was in the middle of our Asian expansion, she said, her voice rising, desperate for him to understand her logic. It was our biggest, most important venture ever. If I had told you then, what would you have done? You would have dropped everything. You would have run off to this little town on a fool's errand to find her. The entire expansion, years of work, would have collapsed. Thousands of jobs, billions of dollars in shareholder value, it would have all been for nothing. So you chose the company, Nolan said, the words heavy with disgust. Again, I chose our legacy, our grandfather's legacy. There is no legacy, he roared, slamming his hand on the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. There is just a pile of money built on a foundation of secrets and lies. He stood up, his towering frame casting a long shadow over her. His voice dropped to a raw, wounded whisper. The first time when we were young, maybe I could have understood. Maybe you were just scared. Maybe you were just a 34-year-old woman trying to follow Father's orders. I could have, maybe one day, found a way to forgive that. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound and final sorrow, the look of a man seeing his sister for the very last time. But every single day for the last 10 years, you woke up knowing the absolute truth, and you chose to stay silent. That wasn't one choice, Celeste, that was thousands of choices. Every year was a choice. Every month was a choice. Every single day, you chose the lie over me, over your own brother. He walked to the door, his movements heavy. It's over. I'm calling a board meeting. I am going to ask for your immediate and permanent resignation as chairman. And if you refuse, I will release this entire story. Everything. You will not control this family or this company ever again. Sadie returned to Bellwether Bay after her final interview in Seattle feeling like she was walking in a dream. She had done it. She had her own news, a future she had built for herself, brick by brick. She found Nolan sitting on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the bay, staring out at the slate-gray water. He looked older than he had a few weeks ago, the stress of the past month having carved new lines into his face. I got the job, she said, her voice quiet as she approached. Nolan turned, and a genuine, though tired, smile touched his lips. It didn't quite reach his eyes, which were filled with a deep sadness. I knew you would. He said, "Congratulations, Sadie. You deserve it more than anyone." "Thank you," she replied, sitting on the far end of the bench, leaving a careful, deliberate space between them. She had seen his public apology. She had read Piper's follow-up story exposing Celeste's long-term deception. She understood now that his creation of the secret fund had not been born of malice, but of a deep-seated, flawed instinct to control. It was the action of the man he used to be, not the man he was trying to become. "I'm going to take the job," she continued, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I'll be moving to Seattle at the end of next month." "I understand," he said, his voice soft. He didn't argue, didn't try to convince her to stay. He just accepted it. "I'm also keeping my name," she said, her words clear and firm, a declaration of identity. "I'm Sadie Monroe. That's who I am. I'm not going to become an Ashford." She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the final, most important boundary. "And I'm not taking any money from you. Not now, not ever, no fun, no inheritance, nothing. I'm going to make my own way." It was her manifesto, a final drawing of the lines that would define their future. She was laying out the terms of their relationship, and they were all on her terms. The old Nolan would have argued, would have insisted on his right to provide for her, would have seen it as his duty. This Nolan simply nodded. "I accept," he said without a moment's hesitation. "Whatever you want. Sadie, whatever boundaries you need to set, I will respect them." A long, comfortable silence settled between them, filled only by the cry of the gulls and the distant clang of a channel marker buoy. "You know," Sadie said, breaking the quiet, "for my whole life I used to wonder about my father. I would make up stories about him in my head. Sometimes he was a sailor lost at sea, or a musician traveling the world, or a soldier. I never in any of my stories imagined he'd be you." Nolan winced at the unintended sting of her words. "I'm sorry I wasn't any of those things." "It's okay," she said, and for the first time, her voice held a note of something that sounded like grace. "I'm not that little girl making up stories anymore. I don't need a hero from a fairy tale. I needed the truth." She stood up, preparing to leave. Nolan's heart ached with a sudden, sharp pang of fear. He thought this was it. She was saying goodbye for good. "Sadie," he said, his voice raw with an emotion he couldn't hide. Can we?" She turned back, her expression patient, waiting. "There's that diner," he said, the words tumbling out. "The Salty Fork. Maybe, when you're back in town visiting your mom on the weekends, maybe we could have breakfast. Once a week or once a month, whatever you're comfortable with." It was the smallest of requests. He wasn't asking to be called her father. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was just asking for a little of her time on her terms. Sadie considered it for a long moment, her head tilted. He wasn't trying to force a relationship. He was asking for permission to continue being in her life, within the strict boundaries she had just erected. "Okay," she said softly. She didn't call him dad. She didn't offer a hug, but she didn't walk away. "We can have breakfast." It wasn't a happy ending. It was a beginning, a fragile tentative and deeply honest one. And for Nolan, it was more than he had ever dared to hope for. The board of Ashford Meridian convened one last time, a virtual summit to decide the company's future. The atmosphere, even through the cold filter of video screens, was heavy with the knowledge that this vote would fundamentally reshape the 40-year-old corporation. Marcus Lee, his tenure as interim CIO having been a steadying, calming influence, laid out the proposal. The recommendation he announced, his voice steady and professional, drafted with the company's independent governance committee and outside legal counsel, is as follows. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Celeste Ashford will resign from her position as chairman and from the board of directors, effective immediately. She will transition to a 3-year advisory role, with no voting power and no authority over personnel. This acknowledges her historical contribution to the company while decisively removing her from operational control. He took a breath. Nolan Ashford will be reinstated as CIO. However, he will be subject to a 6-month probationary period with his performance and strategic decisions reviewed directly by this board. This acknowledges his own role in the crisis, while allowing him to lead the company forward, should he prove he is capable of doing so with a new perspective. It was a balanced, Solomon-like solution. It punished Celeste's decades of deception, while holding Nolan accountable for his own initial, flawed reactions. It was a path forward, not a purge. When it was his turn to speak, Nolan endorsed the plan without hesitation. "I accept these terms," he told the board, his voice humble. "Accountability must start at the top. And that includes me." It was an act of contrition that did more to restore their faith in his leadership than any impassioned speech or backroom power play ever could have. In Bellwether Bay, a different kind of accountability was taking place. Piper Cole posted a public retraction and apology on her podcast's website. She apologized directly to Sadie Monroe for publishing the leaked memo without full context, and for the harm her reporting had caused. It was a rare and courageous move in the fast-paced, often ruthless world of digital media, and it signaled a shift from a journalist chasing a sensational story to a person taking responsibility for her impact. The night before the board's final, formal vote, Lorraine found Nolan on his now familiar bench overlooking the bay. The sun was setting, painting the clouds in fiery shades of orange and purple. "You've been through a lot," she said, her voice a soft counterpoint to the cry of the gulls. "We all have," he replied, his gaze on the horizon. They stood in a comfortable silence for a few minutes, two people with a shared history that was finally, after 30 years, beginning to align. Then Lorraine asked the question that had been lingering in her mind, the final test. "If they vote you out tomorrow," she said, her voice even, "if you lose the company for good, what will you do? Will you stay in Bellwether Bay?" She was asking if his presence here, his effort, was tied to his power, to his role as Nolan Ashford, CIO. She was asking if his desire to be a part of her life, and Sadie's, was just another project. One that would be abandoned if he lost his title. Nolan didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a set of keys and a folded document. He handed them to her. It was a lease agreement for a small two-bedroom cottage on a quiet street on the edge of town. The lease was for 1 year. He had signed it 3 weeks ago. "I'm not going anywhere, Lorraine," he said softly, his eyes finally meeting hers. "My home is here. Now, whether I'm a CIO or not." He had made his choice long before the board made theirs. He had chosen them. Lorraine looked from the lease agreement to his face, and in the fading light, she saw not the powerful billionaire, but the man she had loved all those years ago, the man who had promised to find his way home. "Well," she said, a small, genuine smile finally reaching her eyes as she handed him back the keys. "It's a start." She nodded toward the long, wooden pier. "How about we just go for a walk? No big promises. No talk about the past. Just a walk." Nolan looked at her, at the impossible, incredible second chance he never thought he would have. He smiled back, a real smile full of hope. "I'd like that very much." The board approved Marcus's plan. Celeste resigned, her departure from the company. She had helped build a quiet, unceremonious affair. She sold a significant portion of her stock and moved to the East Coast, her advisory role becoming a distant formality fulfilled through occasional, terse emails. Nolan returned to his position as CIO, not as the titan he had been, but as a humbled and changed man. He delegated more authority. He listened more intently, and he insisted on working 3 days a week remotely from his small cottage in Bellwether Bay. A move that baffled Wall Street, but made perfect sense to him. Marcus remained as COO, their 40-year friendship slowly mending, now rebuilt on a foundation of difficult, painful truths. Sadie moved to Seattle and thrived. She excelled in the management program, her passion and real-world experience setting her apart from her peers. With a competitive grant from an independent community foundation that championed workforce development, she began developing a pilot version of her employee advancement program. Nolan learned about the grant only after she had officially received it, and he celebrated her success with a heartfelt phone call. without once trying to involve himself financially. She came home most weekends to see her mother, and on Sunday mornings, she would meet Nolan for breakfast at the Salty Fork. Their conversations were easy and natural, filled with talk of her work, his new slower-paced life, and the simple, everyday goings-on of the town. Nolan and Lorraine did not rush back into a romance. The chasm of 30 years was too wide to be leaped in a single bound. They took walks on the beach. They had quiet dinners. They went to a family counselor, separately at first, then together. They learned slowly and carefully to talk about their fears and their needs, to untangle the deep, tangled knots of the past without letting them strangle their future. It was a patient, careful process of getting to know the people they had become over 3 decades of living separate lives. One sunny afternoon, nearly a year after it all began, the three of them sat at an outdoor cafe by the harbor. Sadie had just driven in from Seattle for the weekend. She placed a tray with 3 coffees on the small, round table. Nolan looked at the worn silver ring on his finger, turning it slowly. For so long, he said, his voice reflective, speaking more to himself than to them. This was a reminder of what I'd lost. A person, a place, a promise. He looked up, his eyes meeting Lorraine's, then Sadie's. I thought it was the most important thing I owned. But a symbol can't replace the responsibility of actually being here. Lorraine reached across the table and gently touched his hand. A simple, affectionate gesture that spoke volumes. The ring didn't lead you home, Nolan, she said softly. Your choices did. Sadie pushed a coffee cup across the table toward him, a small, playful smile gracing her lips. It was the first time he had seen her look at him with such an easy, unguarded warmth. This time, she said, her hazel eyes twinkling in the sunlight, try not to spill it. Nolan laughed, a real, unburdened sound of pure joy. He picked up the cup. The 3 of them sat together, the sunlight warming their faces, the sound of the ocean, a steady, comforting rhythm in the background. They were not a perfect family. The scars of the past were still there, visible and real. But the secrets were gone. No one was hiding, and no one was deciding for anyone else. They were just 3 people, choosing to be there, together, and for the first time in a very long time, it felt like home. Please remember to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next heartwarming stories. See you next time. Goodbye.